All right, listen up, because this might be the wake-up call you didn't know you needed. There comes a moment when the person who kept their distance, dodged the hard conversations, and built walls instead of bridges, realizes something gut-wrenching. You're gone, not pretending to be, not playing a game. You've actually moved on. And when that hits them, it hits hard. This isn't about revenge. It's not about proving anything. It's about reclaiming your peace, your power, and your worth. Because the second you stopped chasing, everything started to shift. And they started to wake up. Let's talk about what happens when the avoidant finally realizes they lost the one person who saw through the walls and chose to walk away anyway. When you walk away from someone who keeps pushing you away, especially an avoidant type, it's not just a decision. It's a declaration. It says, I'm done begging for connection. I'm done chasing someone who won't meet me halfway. And more than anything, it says, I respect myself enough to let go of what's hurting me, even if I wanted it to work. Avoidant individuals often operate in a cycle. They crave connection deep down, but fear what that closeness might bring. Vulnerability, expectations, accountability. So they do this push-pull dance. They get close just enough to feel connected, but not close enough to feel exposed. And if you're the one on the other side of that cycle, empathetic, patient, willing, you might hang on far longer than you should, believing that if you just show enough love, things will change. But here's the truth. Love alone doesn't fix emotional unavailability. You can't love someone into healing if they're not willing to look at their own wounds. And eventually there comes a moment where the scale tips, when the emotional toll of trying to bridge the gap becomes too heavy. When you realize you're the only one fighting for the relationship, that's the moment you step back, and for some, that's the moment you walk away for good. And when you do that, something shifts, something powerful. Because for someone with avoidant tendencies, your absence is often more jarring than your presence. When you're there, always reaching, always hoping, they can take you for granted. They assume you'll always be there, that no matter how distant they become, you'll wait. But when you stop waiting, when you reclaim your time, your energy, and your emotional bandwidth, they feel that absence like a shock wave. And make no mistake, it's not just about them, it's about you. Walking away is an act of self-preservation. It's not about being cold or heartless. It's about being honest. With yourself and with the situation, you start to realize that loving someone doesn't mean you have to lose yourself. That no matter how deep your feelings are, you deserve to be met with the same emotional availability, the same presence, the same effort. There's a power in choosing yourself. It's not loud or flashy, it's quiet, but it's unshakable. It's the moment when you stop negotiating your worth. You stop shrinking to fit someone else's comfort zone. And what happens next? Growth, healing, space to breathe again. You walk away not to punish, not to manipulate, but because you finally understand that peace is more valuable than potential. That being alone and whole is better than being together and broken. Silence is often misunderstood. People see it as emptiness, as a void, as something that lacks power. But in truth, silence, when it follows chaos, confusion, and emotional neglect, can be the loudest thing in the room, especially when you've been the one holding space in a relationship where the other person only gave you fragments. When you finally stop explaining, stop pleading, stop trying to get through to someone who refuses to open up, your silence becomes a message they can't ignore. For someone with avoidant tendencies, conflict and vulnerability are things to avoid at all costs. They're uncomfortable with emotional intensity, often retreating when things get too close or too real. And while you were likely the one constantly reaching out, checking in, and trying to bridge the emotional gap, they got used to that rhythm. Your voice was always there. Your reassurance, your presence, they counted on it, whether they admitted it or not. But when that stops, when the messages stop coming, the calls stop ringing, the warmth of your effort fades into nothing, that silence speaks volumes. It says everything you were trying to say before, only now it's impossible to interrupt, deflect, or minimize. Silence doesn't beg to be understood. It just is. And that's why it's so powerful. The avoidant might not react right away. In fact, they often won't. At first, they might even feel relief. Finally, no pressure, no expectations. But over time, the absence becomes heavier than the presence ever was. It's in the quiet moments, the ones they used to fill with your texts or your voice or your patience, where they start to notice. That feeling they thought they were avoiding by keeping their distance, it doesn't go away, it just shifts. What they once called space begins to feel like emptiness. Your silence creates contrast. Suddenly, they're forced to sit with what they avoided for so long. Real consequences. And not because you lashed out or made a scene. No, your silence is graceful, it's strong, it comes from clarity, not chaos. And that's what makes it so unmistakably different from the emotional back and forth they're used to. It's not a game, it's not manipulation. It's the final word without saying a single one. What they start to realize, slowly, painfully, is that your presence was never the problem. It was their inability to receive it. Your love was consistent, but they were inconsistent. Your words were vulnerable, but they were guarded. And now, without your voice filling in the blanks, they're left with their own thoughts, their own patterns, and no distraction to soften the truth. For you, silence is not just about stepping back. It's about stepping into your own peace. You've probably spent a long time explaining yourself, trying to justify your needs, hoping that just one more conversation might open a door. But eventually you realize that no amount of explaining will change someone who's not ready to listen. And so you stop talking, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. In that space, you begin to heal. Without the constant tension of trying to be heard, you rediscover your own inner voice. You realize how loud the relationship actually was, not in noise, but in emotional exhaustion. And now, without the pressure to keep it together, you finally get to breathe. The avoidant may circle back eventually, some do. They may test the waters, send a message, try to see if you'll respond. But they'll be met with a different version of you. One who doesn't fill silence out of fear, who doesn't chase after crumbs. Whether you respond or not is your choice. But you'll know that your silence was never a weakness. It was your boundary, your truth, your strength. There's a moment, often quiet, often too late, when the avoidant finally realizes what they've lost. And it doesn't come during the arguments or the tearful confessions or the late night pleas to be seen and understood. It comes after. When the dust has settled, when you've stopped trying, when your energy is no longer orbiting around them, that's when it hits. Avoidant individuals aren't incapable of love, but their relationship with intimacy is tangled in fear, fear of vulnerability, fear of being consumed, fear of losing control. So they keep people at arm's length. They pull away when things get too real, too emotional, too demanding. To them, distance feels like safety. Independence feels like peace. But what they don't always realize in the moment is that the person they're pushing away, the one who showed up, cared, stayed, is also the person who could have brought them the kind of love they secretly longed for, but never believed they deserved. When you were there, they didn't have to face that fear. They could keep dodging, keep denying, keep numbing. They knew you'd understand. You always made the effort. You always softened the blow. So they leaned on the idea that you'd never actually leave, even if they wouldn't admit it out loud. But then you do. Not dramatically, not out of anger. You just stop. The conversations die out. The emotional availability isn't there anymore. You pull your energy back, and for the first time, they're left to face what they've created. Alone? At first, they might rationalize it, tell themselves you were too needy, too sensitive. They might even double down on their own narrative. This is why I don't get close to people. But as time passes and that initial relief wears off, a different feeling starts to creep in, something quieter, but heavier. They start to notice that life feels emptier, that something they can't quite name is missing. But here's the twist. They don't always recognize it immediately as missing you. Avoidants have spent years, sometimes a lifetime, learning how to suppress uncomfortable emotions. So they feel the discomfort, but they might not label it as grief, loss, or regret right away. Instead, it might show up as restlessness, as sadness they can't explain, as a sense of disconnection, even though they've got all the space they thought they wanted. And then one day, it clicks. Maybe they see a photo, hear a song, drive past the place that holds a memory. And suddenly, all the moments you shared, the comfort of your presence, the safety of your support, the kindness in your eyes, flood back in. It's then that the realization hits with full force. I pushed away someone who truly cared, and now they're gone. This moment of clarity isn't always followed by action. Some avoidants retreat even further, ashamed of what they've done. Some try to reach out, hoping it's not too late, and some, tragically, realize what they lost, but still can't bring themselves to break through their own emotional walls. But regardless of how they respond, the internal shift is undeniable. They've lost something, and for them, that realization is earth-shaking because it challenges everything they've told themselves, that closeness leads to pain, that people always leave, that they're better off alone. Now they're forced to confront the truth. Someone stayed, someone tried, and I didn't know how to receive it. What they do with that truth is out of your hands. You've already done the work of showing up, loving deeply, and finally choosing yourself when it became clear they couldn't meet you there. But know this. Your absence taught them something your presence never could. They had to lose you to see you clearly. And while that might not bring them back, it will stay with them because some lessons come too late. And some people only see the light after the door has closed. Growth is one of those things that rarely announces itself with a bang. It doesn't come with a standing ovation, a dramatic turning point, or some cinematic realization. More often, it happens quietly through decisions you make in solitude, in the moments where you choose yourself over and over again, even when it hurts. And when someone avoidant loses you, it's often your growth, not your anger, not your absence, that becomes their biggest wake-up call. Because let's be honest, they didn't think you'd change. They didn't think you'd stop. They assumed, consciously or not, that you would always be there, holding space for them while they pushed you away. They believed they could keep you close enough for comfort, but far enough to feel safe. They underestimated you, not because you were weak, but because your love was steady, your presence was reliable. And for someone who fears emotional intensity, that consistency made them think they had time, that they could avoid, delay, shut down, and you would wait. But something shifted inside you. Slowly, maybe even reluctantly, you started to choose peace over chaos. You stopped needing to be understood and started prioritizing being free. You recognized that constantly proving your worth to someone who couldn't receive it wasn't love. It was self-abandonment. And so you began to change. Not for them, but for you. You grew. And growth isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it looks like not texting back. Sometimes it's refusing to explain yourself one more time. Sometimes it's walking away without the closure you begged for. It's a process that unfolds as you start paying attention to how much energy you've spent on someone who only ever met you halfway. It's what happens when you realize that your heart is not a battleground for someone else's emotional unavailability. That kind of growth can be unsettling for the person left behind, especially for the avoidant, because growth reflects back to them what they have resisted for so long. Your transformation highlights their stagnation. Your healing emphasizes their avoidance. Your calm becomes a mirror for their chaos. And nothing is more jarring to someone stuck in their patterns than seeing the person they once took for granted become someone they can no longer reach. And it's not just that they lost you, it's that they lost access to the version of you that would have waited, explained, forgiven. The version that would have stayed in the loop of hope and hurt. That version doesn't exist anymore. Because growth demands better. It creates boundaries. It lets go with grace. And that is something the avoidant often doesn't expect. They're used to people clinging. They're used to being chased. They're not used to watching someone walk away with dignity and then not come back. Your growth in that sense becomes the lesson. It forces them to sit with the consequences of their behavior, to realize that love isn't guaranteed just because someone once gave it freely. That presence isn't permanent when it's not reciprocated, and most importantly, that people evolve. You evolved. You chose healing. You chose wholeness, and they didn't see it coming. And maybe one day they'll grow too. Maybe your strength will inspire them to face their fears, to stop running from connection, to finally do the work. Or maybe they won't. But whether or not they change, the truth remains. Your growth was never about them. It was about remembering who you are outside of their distance. It was about reclaiming the parts of yourself that you gave away trying to bridge a gap that wasn't yours to fix. And that realization that they didn't just lose you, but lost the chance to meet the version of you that emerged from the fire, they'll carry that, whether they admit it or not. Because while they were avoiding, you were rising. And that is the wake-up call they never expected. There comes a moment after all the chaos, the confusion, and the emotional back and forth where you finally reclaim something you never should have had to fight for in the first place, your peace. And not just any kind of peace, but the deep internal kind that doesn't depend on another person's validation, availability, or affection. This isn't the peace that comes from silence in the room. It's the peace that comes from silence in your mind, from knowing you're no longer tangled in someone else's emotional dysfunction, from finally choosing yourself. Reclaiming your peace and power doesn't start with a dramatic exit. It often begins in subtle ways. You stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. You stop rehearsing what you'll say to them if they reach out. You stop hoping for a version of them that never shows up. You start sleeping better, eating better, thinking clearer. And that clarity, that grounded, calm presence you begin to carry, that's power. Because your power isn't about being louder, tougher, or more distant. It's about not needing the person who kept breaking you to feel whole anymore. For so long, you may have confused love with sacrifice. You may have believed that to prove your worth, you had to be endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving, endlessly understanding. Especially when dealing with someone who shuts down emotionally or pulls away when things get close. You learn to tiptoe around their moods, to be careful not to ask for too much. You tried to become smaller just to stay in their world. But over time, that constant self-editing wears you down. And eventually, something inside of you says, enough. And that's when the shift begins. You realize peace isn't found in walking on eggshells or shrinking to fit into someone's comfort zone. It's found in being fully yourself and being okay if someone can't handle that. Your power returns the moment you stop chasing love and start honoring your own energy. When you stop trying to pull someone out of their emotional hiding places and start building your life without waiting for them to show up. Ironically, the person who once avoided closeness often only sees your value clearly after you stop fighting for them. When you finally reclaim your space, they're left with their own, one that feels emptier now that your steady presence is gone. And while they may have tried to convince themselves they didn't need anyone, your absence proves otherwise. It shows them what true peace looked like, because it was something you carried, even in your pain. They might try to come back. Some do. They might say they've changed or finally understand what they lost. But here's the thing. Your peace and power are not negotiable. Not anymore. When you fought hard to rebuild your sense of self, to heal from the damage of an inconsistent love, you don't hand that over for promises or nostalgia. You know what it cost you to feel whole again. You're not about to lose that for someone who didn't protect it the first time around. This journey isn't about bitterness. It's about boundaries. It's not about revenge. It's about recovery. You don't have to prove anything anymore. You don't have to wait for their apology to validate your worth. You already know what you bring to the table. You already know the kind of love you give. And now you've learned to give that love to yourself first. Reclaiming your peace and power is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one. One where you don't chase people who can't choose you. One where your self-worth is not dependent on someone else's emotional availability. One where you show up fully for yourself, whether someone else can meet you there or not. And in that choice, in that quiet, steady reclaiming, you become the strongest version of yourself, not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough to walk away. Because you knew deep down that staying in something that was slowly destroying your spirit was no longer love. It was self-betrayal. And now, you are home. So here's the truth. Losing someone like you is a lesson, not a punishment. You gave love, patience, loyalty, and presence to someone who couldn't meet you halfway, and when you finally walked away, it wasn't out of anger. It was out of self-respect. That decision, that silence, that growth, that peace you reclaimed, it all sent a message louder than words ever could. I will not keep bleeding for someone who refuses to heal. And maybe one day they'll realize what they lost. Maybe they'll see the rare kind of love you offered. But by then, it won't matter, because you won't be standing in the same place. You'll have already moved forward, stronger, wiser, whole. This isn't just about them losing you. This is about you finally finding you.